Hi, everyone. I hope you're well, and thank you for joining us. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this COVID-19 vaccine Q&A event. As you know, vaccines have been introduced and are now widely available to help combat the most serious COVID-related illnesses. We've offered this session to U.S. employees to help answer your questions about the vaccines. Throughout the session, you can view or submit your questions at slido.com using event code #Invesco. We've already gotten more than 70 questions, and there are a lot of common themes. In Slido, you can upvote and downvote questions according to your interest. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Jayne Morgan, who is a cardiologist and executive director of the COVID task force at Piedmont Healthcare in Atlanta, the largest healthcare system in Georgia. Dr. Morgan has been named to the Health Equity and COVID Task Force for the governor of Georgia and selected to support the Department of Health in its Ask the Expert series. Additionally, Dr. Morgan serves as a CNN medical expert contributor and is the owner and creator of the Stairwell Chronicles, a social media series addressing questions surrounding COVID vaccines in a conversational format. Welcome, Dr. Morgan, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I look forward to it.
I'm also pleased to introduce Sally Haskalow, who's Invesco's head of HR corporate and a member of our Return to Office Global New Normal Steering Committee. Sally has kindly offered to be our moderator today, and we appreciate your participation, Sally.
Yes, hello, thank you.
Before we get started, let me reiterate two comments that you would have seen on the invitation. The first is that no question about the science of the vaccines is off limits. Dr. Morgan is well versed on addressing questions about the safety and effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccinations. What we aren't covering today, though, are questions about Invesco's vaccine policy. I know there are questions in Slido on this topic, but that's not what we're here today to discuss with Dr. Morgan. Our time with Dr. Morgan is best spent answering your questions about COVID-19 vaccines. You can go to our COVID Invesco Together website to view the memos that we've sent previously and read the FAQs we've prepared on the rationale for mandating vaccination. We'll certainly review your submitted policy-related questions and look to address them further, either in FAQs over the next few weeks or in another forums like this. So without further delay, let me turn it over to you, Dr. Morgan, to make a few opening comments. And Sally, maybe you can help set the table by posing some of the questions that we're all seeing in Slido.
Thank you, John. And thank you to Invesco for inviting me here today. You know, we are a year and a half into a pandemic that we thought would last about 60 or 90 days. You may not remember, we were all going to shelter in place and let the virus pass. And so we could then come back out and resume our lives. So here we are a year and a half later. It's been quite a journey. I know people have lots of questions. I do these all of the time. With the vaccines rolling out, boosters, third shots, immunocompromised, it just gets incredibly more and more complicated as the science evolves. I looked at the questions that you all submitted, really excellent, thoughtful questions. So I am anxious and interested and excited really to be able to interact with you all today and hopefully get your questions answered.
Great, thank you, Dr. Morgan. And so, as we mentioned, we have a lot of questions, and we're going to jump right in with the first one here, which has been voted up the most in our Slido. And I'm going to read it verbatim here, and I'm not sure what VAERS means. You probably do, but per VAERS, there have been 14,506 deaths, 58,440 hospitalizations, 6,422 heart attacks, and 5,371 reports of myocarditis, each CT reported after receiving the COVID-19 vaccination. So vaccine reactions to COVID-19 vaccines exceed all other vaccines combined, why are the COVID-19 vaccines not held to the same safety standards?
So great question, whoever posed that. So the VARE system, let's talk about that. This is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS, V-A-E-R-S. This is a self-reporting system where anyone, people, physicians, neighbors, can input any data at all that you think is relevant to your vaccine. And so what these numbers represent are all of the reports that have come in that someone or entities feel are associated, relevant, or even caused by the vaccine. These are not the adjudicated numbers. The adjudicated numbers are after all of these cases have been reviewed, then what are the actual numbers of the direct causality? Those numbers are not available to the public. So this is literally what anyone may think is relevant to the COVID vaccine. And since the vaccines are new, you can imagine that almost anything is considered to be relevant. But then once it's adjudicated, meaning that they actually review the case, there's a determination that is made whether this is relevant or not. The reason that we use this VAERS system, you may say, well, why use it at all? Because anybody, any Tom, Dick, or Harry can just throw anything in there. That's true. But the reason that it is helpful is that it allows us to pick up what we call signals. If we start to get multiple reports of something, so I'm going to make it up, gallstones. Suddenly in the month of May, we have 1,000 reports of gallstones. These are signals that we can begin to track quickly and damp down on. But as long as there are not signals that are coming up in the system, the cases are adjudicated. So this literally is what we call in science raw data. It's not clean. No one's looked at it. It's what everybody thinks. And then on the back end, we actually have the clean data. And so you can imagine, as an example, you're admitted to the hospital, let's say with heart disease. You also happen to have a diagnosis of lung cancer and diabetes. Well, you might die or not survive that hospitalization based on your heart having some failure. But then it could be related to the cancer. And someone could say, well, the cancer is what killed Bob or Greg, when in fact, Greg died with the cancer and not from the cancer. He died from the heart disease. And that was what is on the death certificate. So this is what we see here, VAERS. It's still very important, but just remember what you see from the public is just raw data, literally everything people are putting in what they think. It may or may not be relevant.
Thank you for that clarification. And so it's a way to have an early warning system, so to speak,
Right.
that's just kind of crowdsourced.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it gives us a little confidence that the experts are looking over this data. So thank you for that. Our next question, we have many of these. So I'll read the one that came to the top, but many of these is if I already have antibodies from COVID-19 from past infections, why do I need to get a vaccine?
So when we look at, really this question is about native immunity versus vaccine immunity. That's really at the heart of what this question is about. Native immunity, meaning I have my own antibodies because I actually had the infection, versus someone else who has antibodies because they got the vaccine. And so what's the difference and what's better? And why are we asking people to mix them? When we look at native immunity, meaning you have actually had the virus, we see that you have really excellent immunity for 30 days. After 30 days, that immunity for people who've had the infection drops slightly in about the 80 to 82% range. That's still actually very good, but not as high as our vaccines. We have some that drop to that 80 to 85% range. And then we have others that do a precipitous drop, meaning they just level out and they drop all the way down close to zero. We have no way of determining who's who. who's going to go on to long level, pretty good immunity, up in 80%, that's really pretty good, and who's going to drop off. Because we can't make a determination between those two, we are recommending that everyone, even if they've already been infected, move forward with the vaccine such that we can make certain that not only that you are covered, but that you are covered to the highest degree of everyone else in our society, because we're trying to prevent these variants from developing. And another point that I'm going to make about these variants is be aware of this terminology that is being used. If you can recall, earlier in our pandemic, we used the term mutations. And then at some point you started hearing this term variant, and that maybe was inconsequential to you, but in science, that's not innocuous. That is not a random term. That is a very specific term that denotes an escalation. So here's the difference. A variant is actually a cluster of several mutations that have come together to form a new version of the original virus. That is an escalation from mutations. And that is why the scientific community is concerned. So the Delta variant is actually not the same virus from the original virus. This is a new version of that virus. Because of that, we want to make certain that everyone, whether you have native immunity or vaccine immunity, you have the highest level of immunity possible, such that there are fewer opportunities for this virus to invade our bodies, replicate, and then form these mutations that now are clustering together and giving us these variants. The flip side of that, and I'm going to answer the other question that's probably being asked, well, if I have some antibodies, why can't I skip the vaccine? That's actually a very good question, and we are looking at that. The reason you can't skip the vaccine right now is we don't have any data on what it looks like if you skip the vaccine. What I will say by looking at some of the data is that there probably is a very good argument to be made that if you have had the virus itself, the SARS-CoV-2 virus or the COVID-19 disease, then you probably only need one additional shot of a vaccine. The infection itself probably is sufficient enough to serve as one of those shots, and you probably only need a second shot. But this is Dr. Jayne Morgan talking, not the FDA and the CDC. And so we have to go on data and not what I think is rational. I think that that is reasonable and rational. We have no data on it. And the CDC, the FDA, the NIH are all going to be data-driven. And we want everybody to be certain they have the maximal level of protection as we continue to try to prevent variants from forming.
Thank you for that. We're talking a little bit now about long-term consequences around the vaccines. So can you, a couple of things, can you unequivocally state by answering yes or no that there will be no long-term negative consequences from taking any of the available vaccines? And a question related to that that we have had many of really has to do with what about the side effects? What are they? How can we deal with those?
Right. So when we look at the long-term side effects or the long-term effects of a vaccine, one of the things that we're looking at, I'm assuming you all are asking about the messenger RNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer. One of the reasons that we're not concerned about long-term side effects is because messenger RNA has been around in the lab since the 1970s. We've had it for a long time. The reason we have not been successful in integrating it into therapeutics or medicines or vaccines is because messenger RNA denatures quickly, which means it dissolves or disintegrates or disappears. And so we've never been able to keep it around long enough for it to exert any effects. So we finally learned how to do this over 50 years of studying messenger RNA. And we've incorporated it into these vaccines, and more therapeutics are coming specifically in the area of oncology and cancer with messenger RNA. But the reason, to answer the question, that we don't anticipate long-term side effects is because of that property of messenger RNA. Shortly after it's injected into your body, it disappears. It goes away, it denatures. So literally there's nothing there to cause a long-term side effect. The other reason, the other question that sometimes is underlying that is about genetics. Well, is it going to impact, will I have a 3-headed baby? Or will my grandkids have some rare disease? It certainly does not impact the DNA. Messenger RNA and DNA sound a lot alike, right? Deoxyribonucleic acid, ribonucleic acid, they sound exactly the same. Most of the people even in science can't remember what the difference is. So it's very confusing. But messenger RNA, when it's inside of your body, enters the cell in the cytoplasm. That's the fluid that is in the outer rim of your cells. So it enters your cell and it floats in the cytoplasm. It never enters the nucleus, which is the center hole, like the iris of your eye, the center of the cell. And that nucleus is where your DNA is housed. That's your genetic material. It doesn't enter the nucleus, it only enters the cytoplasm. So those are the answers and the reasons. And then the other question I think that you asked is, what are the side effects? The other thing that we know about vaccines, messenger RNA vaccines, viral vector vaccines like the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, our live attenuated vaccines like our measles, mumps, rubella, all of these vaccines, is that generally when you're going to see side effects, they always appear within the first 2 weeks to 2 months. We rarely, if ever, see side effects beyond 2 months that suddenly appear years down the road. So they always make an appearance. The more severe side effects of the vaccines are with the messenger RNA vaccines. You've probably heard of myocarditis. This is the inflammation of the lining of the heart, which occurs generally in young men under the ages of 35. It is entirely treatable. I'm not going to mitigate it and say it's not dangerous. It is, it's very serious, but it's also very treatable. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The other side effect is lymphadenopathy with these messenger RNA vaccines. Lymphadenopathy is swelling of your lymph nodes on the same side of the body that you received the injection. So you might have axillary lymph nodes, meaning under your arm, you get a swollen lymph node, or supraclavicular, right at the top of your collarbone or the back of your neck on the side of that vaccine. That's called lymphadenopathy. That can be very scary for women who have a history of breast cancer or family history of breast cancer, and they suddenly get swelling of nodes near and around their breast. But we do see that occurring in about 5% of women who receive the messenger RNA or the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccines. It generally disappears within 7 days on its own. But the important thing is, if you're getting a workup for breast cancer and you have mammograms or ultrasound scheduled, we do not want you to cancel those. We want you to inform your physician, inform the radiographer that you've had this vaccine, such that there's not what we call diagnostic confusion. They don't see a lymph node and get it confused with having cancer, and you end up with this escalated workup that can be costly, and not to mention how emotional and mentally distressing this is, that you're having a cancer workup, you don't actually have cancer, that it's an artifact. And then the third thing that we know with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I think I saw a question about Guillain-Barré syndrome, so neurologic syndrome, and I think I'll answer that question now. The question about Guillain-Barré, can I get the vaccines if I had Guillain-Barré? The answer to that is yes. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine does have a warning about Guillain-Barré. The reason for that is that there was one additional incidence of Guillain-Barré in the Johnson & Johnson people who got the actual vaccine. When you do trials, one group gets the vaccine, the other group gets a placebo, not the real vaccine. So there was one additional case of Guillain-Barré in the group that actually got the vaccine, one greater than you would see in the general population. That's very negligible. However, it does qualify for a warning. And as I said, we're actually following all the rules. So that warning is there. You do have an option, if you find that still to be too risky, of the messenger RNA vaccines, who have no risk of Guillain-Barré. You're free to take Moderna and Pfizer. The other thing that we have with Johnson & Johnson, obviously, are these blood clots that occur in women between the ages of 18 and 50. They cluster in women between the ages of 34 and 40. Most of them occurred in women between the ages of 34 and 40. The 18-year-olds and 50-year-olds were outliers. This was only one woman in the group was on birth control pills, so it's independent of birth control pills. The rate of blood clots is 7 in 1 million. That is incredibly and exceedingly rare. And to give you an example, since I brought up birth control pills, your risk of a blood clot with taking birth control pills is 1 in 1,000. And you probably take those every day. The risk of a blood clot with this vaccine is 7 in 1 million. In fact, you're more likely to be admitted to the emergency room with a pogo stick injury than you are to getting a blood clot from this vaccine. So hopefully that answers a slew of questions with regard to adverse events, side effects, what we know about long-term effects. And so to answer your question directly, you asked me directly, you said, yes or no. Can I say 100% that there will be no long-term effects from this vaccine? And so I will say no, I cannot say that. And in science, we really you can almost never use the words always or never. In fact, when you're taking a standardized exam, if always or never are in the answer, that probably isn't the right answer. You can eliminate that one and go to the next one. So absolutely, I cannot say always or never, but I can give you the probabilities and I can give you the science behind why we think that.
Thank you. That was a great answer, very detailed. We're now going to talk, and there were many questions embedded in this as well, on, can you please explain how the unvaccinated put the vaccinated at risk? And this question that's been voted up goes on to say, according to news reports, the vaccinated transmit the virus. However, they would be less likely to stay at home because they don't have symptoms. An unvaccinated individual would be more likely to feel sick and stay at home.
So the answer to that question is predicated on what I talked about earlier with mutations and variants. It is in the unvaccinated where the virus finds a home and has the ability to replicate. Replication errors, mistakes actually that the virus makes, that's what we know of as mutations. These mistakes can sometimes make the virus more virulent. They can also sometimes make it weaker. In this case, the mutations that we discuss and the variants that we discuss are the ones that are making the virus more difficult for us to manage. It's the unvaccinated population where those opportunities occur. When you are thinking about the virus, you have to think that all species on Earth thrive for life. Viruses want to live, humans want to live. Survival goes to the fittest. In science, the fittest is not the strongest. The fittest is the most adaptable. The most adaptable species always survives. Viruses are incredibly adaptable. And so we want to remove ourselves from their life cycles. Human beings, the Homo sapiens, are the key linchpin of the life cycle of this virus. Without us, literally, the virus would die. It depends on humans in order to replicate and create these mutations. So it's in the unvaccinated that it finds its greatest opportunities. So that is why, not because of transmissibility, it's with regard to how are we going to continue to stop the development of these variants? Remember, I said these are new versions of the virus. How are we going to stop the development of these variants that are continuing to develop in the unvaccinated? These variants then have the opportunity or the possibility of challenging the immune status of the rest of us. Eventually, a variant will develop that has the ability to overcome our vaccines. And then we have to start all over again at square one. That is why the unvaccinated are a threat to the vaccinated population.
Thank you for that. Our next question, Dr. Morgan, has to do with some of the statistics here. So I'm going to read this for you here. And it has to do with what is the justification for recommending a healthy adult use the vaccine and having no studies on potential long-term effects in the latest CDC morbidity and mortality weekly report, which says the number of cases, including Delta, in unvaccinated 50 to 64-year-olds is 0.0724%, hospitalizations 0.0087%, and deaths 0.0012%.
Yeah, so I'm going to combine that question with the one before, which also gives a statistic about the 99.9% survival. Why should we get vaccines? Yep. So let's think about that with regard to numbers. I'm going to start with, I think that's number 4 and go to number 5. So the survivability, and then, all of these, the Delta variant numbers. When we look at survivability, really what we call that in science is the recovery rate. How many people actually recover from this? And so this, person gave the statistic of 99.9%. The value that I see as of last Thursday, we have this data comes out every Thursday, is 97% to 99.75%. So very close. Okay, so we'll go with 99.9%. It's all in that arena. But I want you to think about what that means with regard to survivability. That literally means that between 1 and 12 people per 400 people die. So just think about that. That's what 97 to 99% means. That means that what we have currently in the US, 1 in every 500 Americans has died from COVID-19. That's the 99%. So that number sounds high. That's a percentage. But when you talk about actual numbers and we're talking about people, 1 in 500 people have died. If we look at that statistic of 97 to 99.75, which was the last statistic that came out in the MMR last Thursday. So we should think about that very closely, because if you think about things like, you say, well, that's so high, why should I be bothered with it? It's 99%, it's 98%. What's the difference between 1 and 2%? Well, here's the difference. The University of Georgia enrolls 37,606 students. That means that we would say to the University of Georgia that we are okay with 38 of their students dying every year. That's fine with us. 38 students would die. That's what that statistic is telling us. The Ohio State University has 67,000. So every year we would be okay with 67 college students at the University of, at Ohio State University. So when we look at numbers, we have to look at numbers and not statistics. This is an incredibly high number with regard to death. This is a terrible recovery rate number. 1 in 500 people die. That's what that number says. They've just phrased it such that it looks like, and used this term survivable. And so when you're reading it with a non-scientific background, you say, oh my God, everybody survives. That was intentionally written that way. And I do a whole thing on misinformation. This is a great example of misinformation, how words matter and how the text provides a context for you that leads you down one path when that's not actually what that means. That's the same for question number 5. When you look at the MMR and you look at unvaccinated hospitalizations and deaths, these are not inconsequential numbers.
Thank you for putting that into perspective. Our next question here, it goes back to this natural immunity, but has to do, someone has had COVID twice, my goodness, each time relatively mild. They've had an antibody test that shows they have both mature and recent antibodies. First question related to this is, does the vaccine provide additional protection? You talked a little bit about that, but can you also talk a little bit about these antibody tests in general? What does that tell us? What can we learn about those?
Right. So first, let me say I'm sorry that you were infected twice. That is really horrible. And you may have some long-term consequences from that. I think it's a great example of why we are trying to get people vaccinated, because what has happened to you is that you were infected with one virus and then you became reinfected with a subsequent variant that developed later. And you didn't have any protection from the vaccines. So you were infected. Remember, these variants are new versions of the original virus. So a reinfection really means that you're infected with a different variant. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say after 30 days, you have a drop in your immunity level. Some people go on to pretty good immunity, but it's still lower than the vaccines, and others drop off precipitously. And it makes you vulnerable. And it also makes you a target of these mutations and variants developing. What we know about antibody testing, and I want to be clear about this, we have no commercially available antibody tests to the public that have been FDA approved and validated. So it is the wild, wild west out there. So if you are just using your own test, I can't really explain what your results are because they're not validated, and none of those commercially available products have been validated. So that should be the first hint to you about their accuracy. But let's just say you're actually going to a medical facility and having your antibodies drawn. What we don't know, but we think, but what we don't know is whether or not your antibody levels actually correlate to your degree of protection. And one thing we want to specifically test is the nucleocapsid protein, specifically, especially if you've been vaccinated. So just make certain wherever you go that it is a validated source, so a medical center, and then you have someone there who's actually able to read and interpret your results. And then your last question is, do you need a vaccine? So you heard Dr. Morgan's position on, if you've been infected, I think that that could probably serve as one dose of the vaccine. You've been infected twice. That means you have had 2 different variants now, which is quite unfortunate. Would that serve as 2 doses? I don't know. So you're now out in that gray area of, we have no data on you. So I would recommend that you at least move forward with 1 dose of the vaccine. And I would also recommend that you highly follow public health measures and wear a mask, wash your hands, practice social distancing. Certainly while this Delta variant is circulating, this particular variant has a viral load 1,200 times higher than all of the previous variants. That is why people who are vaccinated can still transmit it, because the viral load is just that high. And that leads me to answer another question. Someone quoted the Oxford University Research Group, who published a paper that said that vaccinated people had a viral load 251 times higher than unvaccinated people. So that was a complete misconstruction of actually what they published. And I think they published a complete clarity on that. I think there was a group called the Defender and also the Children's Health Defense Group. These are anti-vax organizations who once again took the data and twisted the data. Here's what the data shows. In that Oxford paper, that exact Oxford paper, so read it, and here's what the data shows. The data doesn't show that vaccinated people have 251-fold increase in viral particles in their nose and throat compared to unvaccinated. The data showed that vaccinated people carried particles 251 times higher in their nose and throat with the Delta variant versus previous variants. That's what that Delta showed. That's what that data showed. But since these websites take advantage of the fact that most people aren't actually going to read the studies, and if they read them, they're not going to understand them, they just give you a false conclusion that drives their agenda. And I don't have an agenda one way or another, but since you asked me about that paper, I actually looked it up and read it. And here's what the paper showed. The paper showed that people who were vaccinated have a 251 times higher viral load with the Delta variant compared to people who were vaccinated and the previous variants. So that's exactly what I'm saying. This Delta variant is very virulent. And we know that. And that's why the unvaccinated are a threat to the vaccinated, because these variants keep developing and they're making it harder and harder for us to keep them at bay.
Thank you for that. This has been in the news a lot, so it's a bit of a professional opinion question, and that is, based on what you've learned and read, do you believe COVID-19 was created in a lab or did it come from nature?
So I actually don't have any idea, but here's what I'm going to say to that. In nature, we had, the reason this is called the SARS-CoV-2, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, that number 2 is not random. That's an indicator to all scientists that this is the second time that we have seen this. So when was the first time we saw it? We saw it for the first time in 2003 when we had a SARS outbreak, severe acute respiratory syndrome in humans. At that time, we had our global pandemic surveillance teams in place, and we were able to keep that outbreak by and large off of American shores. But scientists all over the world had alarm bells ringing for a couple of reasons. One is the virus, and I've already gone over what do viruses do? They replicate and they mutate really quickly. That's a concern. We call this particular species quite fit, that fittest. Scientists refer to viruses as being quite fit. That means that's our Darwinism term to say, these viruses have their stuff together. We better be on lookout. So they are fit. Number 2, they're spread by respirations. We are Homo sapiens. As Homo sapiens on a single planet Earth in this galaxy, our atmosphere is made of nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. We require air. We cannot opt out of air. We can't say, oh, we've got a pandemic, I'll skip air in 2020. We're unable to do that. And so to answer your question, whether it came from the lab, whether it came from nature or some other, I don't know, but I do know that we had a SARS outbreak in 2003. And then we had a sister family of the coronaviruses in 2012, the MERS outbreak, that if you follow science, you may or may not remember it, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. Once again, our pandemic surveillance teams globally were still in place, and we were able to contain that outbreak to Saudi Arabia. That was a sister virus in the coronavirus families. So prior to this pandemic, scientists had 2 warning shots fired that a pandemic was coming, 2003 and then in 2012. That was why when we were able to get these vaccines together, we had 17 years of research that had been completed because scientists understood the gravity of what we were seeing. And when I say all of the research was completed, all of the preclinical work was done, all of the bench work research was completed. The identification of all 30,000 base pairs of this base pairs of the genetic sequence of this virus had already been identified and analyzed, and the mechanism of action of infecting and invading our bodies, that spike protein that binds to the angiotensin converting enzyme receptors of our cells, had already been identified. We hadn't even had the first case of COVID on our shores in the United States. When the vaccines came, these are not miracle drugs. I've heard them described as miracle drugs. These drugs are a testament to the dedication and discipline of almost 2 decades of work by science to prepare for a pandemic that was surely coming. 2 warning shots were fired, 2003 and 2012.
Thank you for that. This next question, you've already talked about SIDS, but it also says COVID vaccines have also caused death in adults and people who have had no symptoms or signs of the sickness. So the question is, who takes responsibility and liability of those who take the vaccine?
Right. So that's not really a scientific question, but what I'm going to answer with that is almost the same answer that I had with VAREs. And I'm not saying that whatever this death loss of your family member was not caused by the vaccine, but I'm going to say that it was rare. I'm not going to say it's not related to the vaccine, but I'm going to say that it's rare. I'm not going to say it never happens, because we never use the words never and always in science. But what I will say is, get good information. And if that happened, I am very, very sorry. Truly, we do not have a single FDA approved drug in the United States of America in the history of the FDA that does not have some side effects, that has not caused some untoward death, unfortunately, but nothing is on the market that is considered a danger to health. As in context, I would say aspirin, that actually became available before the FDA was formed in the United States, would today never, ever pass FDA regulations to be available for human consumption, because that's how dangerous it is based on all FDA regulations. Aspirin would absolutely never be approved to be available.
Wow, thank you for that. This is a question that has to do with the true ingredients in these vaccines, and it's based on research. These COVID vaccines contain animal products from chimps and guinea pigs and aborted fetus tissue, in which none of these I believe in putting in my body. Do you have the true list of the ingredients and where they are derived from?
Right. I saw that question. The words
Yes.
true were in quotation marks, as if there's some hidden ingredients. They're the real ingredients. They're the hidden ingredients. So all the ingredients are available and listed on the website. So I'm going to address the question about aborted fetuses. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines used aborted fetus, a single aborted fetus, and I'm not making any ethical claims one way or another. I'm just giving you the history, right? This is just science. So back in the 1950s, there was a single aborted fetus that was in the labs from a miscarriage. It was not a forced abortion, but a woman miscarried. They used those cells and brought them into the lab, and those cells have become immortal. So that's another complete topic. I can talk to you about the immortality of cells, like HeLa cells and things that we use in the lab. These are immortal cells that came from a single fetus that was a spontaneous miscarriage back in the 50s. And now those cells are immortal. And they are used in labs everywhere to study and look at all types of drugs. So I want to say that I'm not saying it makes it better or worse, but I'm just saying it's a single. So it's not as if there are abortions happening all the time. There was a spontaneous miscarriage in the 50s. Those cells now have become immortal, so they can use these cells. These cells were used in the testing of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, their early testing, but they were not used at all in the development or manufacturing of their vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine does use some of these cells in its manufactured product.
Okay, so I think your advice is for whoever asked this question is on the websites. You will find
on the website. And the other question, I think you asked about true ingredients. I don't know. I've seen questions about allergies and contraindications. So I don't know. There are no animal products and all of these things. Again, really check your sources. And I need for you guys to come out of your social media rabbit holes. And because you tend to get the same information from the same people. And next thing you know, there are millions of rabbits down there. Everybody's reproducing, and, you know, come out of there, come into the light and get some real scientific information, the good, the bad, the ugly. I'm not here to cover for science. I'm giving you the information. And that's really it. And then you can kind of make a decision, but make a decision with good information. So one of the other ingredients that I want to talk about, because somebody asked about, I think they didn't use these terms, but a contraindication to the vaccine. Is there any reason why I wouldn't take the vaccine or something to that effect? Polyethylene glycol is in the messenger RNA vaccines. It is a type of fat. So by and large, these vaccines are made of what we call lipids or fats, salt, and glucose or sugar. And then the messenger RNA is added. One of the fats is called polyethylene glycol. If you have an allergy to polyethylene glycol, this is the only, excuse me, this is the only contraindication to getting these vaccines. You would know that you have an allergy to polyethylene glycol because this substance is often found in stool softeners or laxatives like Miralax and colon preps. So if you've ever had an allergic reaction to a stool softener or a laxative or colon prep, definitely let your physician know ahead of getting these vaccines. That is the only absolute contraindication to getting these vaccines, is a reaction to polyethylene glycol within these vaccines.
Thank you. This next question, Dr. Morgan, has to do with addressing, why so many healthcare professionals are refusing to take the vaccine. Perhaps they know something we don't know, but doctors and nurses are speaking out against this. So is there anything that we should know around that? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I think that it's such a sad testimony to show the power of social media and the power of misinformation. And the power of ideology, following an ideology above that really takes precedence over your scientific training. And so this is a great example of ideology overtaking scientific training. And then what happens is you identify pieces of misinformation that reinforce your ideology beliefs. And so I find this very sad and disheartening and disconcerting, because definitely they're not all good things about this vaccine. And I hope that you can see that I'm being as transparent and honest. I share the good, the bad, the ugly. Nothing is 100%. But I do find that these particular people who are in healthcare are doing a great disservice to the pandemic and are continuing to propagate the lengthening of this pandemic. And they're able to do so because they rely on their credentials, when in fact, they're being led more by ideology and then following information that is supporting that ideology. And so that's my take on that. And I'm sorry to hear that. What I would say is, I give a whole talk on misinformation. So just quickly, how you might be able to identify misinformation. One of the things is it posted on a website or a portal that is not available or used by masses? So you sort of have to be in a small sect or specific area or organization or group to have had access to it. Does it tout that they are the only ones who have this information? You can't find this information anywhere else. Does it give extreme language that can be trigger words like the left will have you think, the right will have you believe? Does it also give you the person's qualifications ad nauseum? Most people who are speaking don't necessarily give you their qualifications. Does it say a repeatedly cited famed microbiologist out of Europe? All of these are hints. Does it use scientific language that you don't really understand and it sounds official? like the person who says a 99.9% survivability. That's not even a scientific term. They've used words that they know you will relate to. Does it evoke emotion? Science pretty much is unemotional. It's just data. It's just information. So if you're reading something and you're feeling angry or upset, or you need to immediately retweet it, stop for a second. Is that science? Science really isn't usually that dramatic. It's pretty dry. It's just data. It's just information. So these are all things to think about. And I think the doctors and nurses, it's a small segment, unfortunately, but I think they also are subject to misinformation.
Okay. I think we have time for one more, which we've gotten a few on here too. If you're eligible for a booster, then the next month, if that goes forward here, should you wait to get your flu shot? Have there been any studies performed that the COVID vaccine and the standard flu shot, can you have them in the same time? Do you need to wait in between? What is your advice on that?
So you absolutely can get them both together, and you can't get them both in the same arm. They're spaced 1 inch apart. You don't need to know that. Your doctors and nurses should know that. You can certainly get them in different arms, but we do know because of the immunogenicity of both the flu vaccines and the COVID vaccines, you can actually get them at the same time in the same setting. And actually Moderna now has developed a combination vaccine of COVID vaccine and flu vaccine that they have started in their clinical trials. And hopefully we'll see that in the next year or two.
Great. Okay.
There are a couple of questions. Okay, go ahead.
Unless you had one that you wanted to answer.
So there are a couple I wanted to ask. Somebody asked about D-dimers. Is a very specific question. Doesn't a COVID vaccine give us D-dimers and create blood clots? No, that's exactly the opposite. The COVID-19 disease increases your D-dimers. There's absolutely no data to show that the COVID vaccines increase D-dimers. So this again is misinformation. COVID-19 disease itself not only increases D-dimers, but we know that this is an endothelial disease, increasing blood clotting. And so we see an increased risk of strokes and heart attacks in people who are infected with COVID-19, that elevated D-dimer, which is a lab report. The person who asked that question either has some medical background or, again, you're getting this off of websites. So please be careful about what you're reading. Last thing I do want to make a point about is myocarditis, because I don't want to minimize it. I want to make a point about that. It occurs in young, healthy men. I think I saw a question to say, if we have young, healthy men, why would we get the vaccine and risk myocarditis when if I don't get the vaccine, I don't have a risk of myocarditis at all? And so that's relatively true. You do have some risk, but let's just say, for argument's sake, that that's absolutely true. Remember, we never say always or never in science. Well, let's just say for this example, if you're a young male, you absolutely would never get myocarditis. And if you get the vaccine, you would get myocarditis. So I'm just making this simple, right? This is totally non-scientific, but I'm making an example. These are not the two groups that you need to compare. The two groups that you need to compare is the group of young men who get the vaccine versus the group of young men who don't get the vaccine but get infected with the virus. That's what we're trying to protect. So if you are a male and you are infected with the virus itself, your chances of developing myocarditis, this inflammation of the heart, is 450 in 10,000. If you get the vaccine, your chances of developing myocarditis is 67, in 1,000, as opposed to 77. Okay, I'm going to go again. This is millions. 450 in 1 million, as opposed to 67 in 1 million for those who've been vaccinated with 2 shots. And if you only got 1 shot, it's 77 in 1 million. So those are the groups to compare, not the healthy group of men, because you're presuming that they'll never be infected. What we're looking at is if you get infected with the vaccine, your risk is 450. as opposed to if you get the vaccine itself. If you get infected with the virus, is 450, as opposed to if you get the vaccine itself, then your risk is 77. Those are the two groups to compare. We're trying to protect you in case you get infected. So we're in a pandemic. So that's what we're trying to compare when we do that.
Thank you. So Joan, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thank you for all of your questions. We got through a lot more than we thought maybe at the beginning here. We have a few left out here, but John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sally. And Dr. Morgan, thank you for enlightening us in such a straightforward manner about the science behind these COVID-19 vaccines. We greatly appreciate your expertise on this very complex topic and look forward to seeing you speak about this in the media and through your Stairwell Chronicles on social media. Thanks everybody for your time. We trust you found this session informative. Hope you all have a good day. Thanks again.
Thank you.